So this week I ask you to begin the process of writing a thesis-based paper. So you may be asking yourself, what is a thesis-based paper? Well, I'll begin answering that by answering the question, what is a thesis? So a thesis is a statement that identifies the topic and the main point of a piece of writing and gives the reader an idea of what the text will cover. It's a specific response to a controlling question. So in other words, the thesis is an answer to a question that controls what goes into a paper and the approach and stance the writer takes. So let's deal with that next, a controlling question. Now, in a persuasive paper often responds to a should question. Should state legislatures make teaching cursive mandatory in elementary school? Now, we could write a very decent paper about that, and we've talked about it over the last couple of weeks, in fact, in some example papers. But we're not writing a position paper this time. We're not writing a persuasion paper. We're not writing an argument. So I don't want you to frame for this thesis-based paper assignment a should question. Instead, I want you to consider a why question, a how question, or a what makes question. Because these are other common academic questions. So if I ask, why is cursive handwriting fallen out of favor? I'm actually asking for the causes. If I ask, how does learning cursive handwriting benefit young students? I'm actually asking an effects question. And cause and effects are two of the most important academic questions you can ask. In fact, entire disciplines, history, chemistry, are really the study of cause and effects. The what makes question is a question of evaluation. We're actually trying to determine if one thing is better than another. So what makes learning typing more important than learning good penmanship? And so that's an evaluation question, and that's the kind of question I want you to ask and answer in this particular paper. Now, the fancy name for the why and how question is causal analysis, and I don't necessarily want to get caught up in the fancy terminology. But in your book this week, I've asked you to read a sample essay in The Little Seagull about the Truman-Dewey 1948 presidential election. Why did Truman win the 1948 presidential election is a good why question. How did Truman upset Dewey in 1948? That's a good how question. I guess they're both getting at the same thing. And so you see in a thesis that introduces that topic, although Truman's defeat was heavily predicted, those predictions themselves, Dewey's passiveness as a campaigner, and Truman's zeal turned the tide for a Truman victory. That becomes the answer to that question. How did he do it? Why did Truman win? Well, it turns out to be the predictions themselves, Dewey's passiveness, Truman's zeal as a candidate. Those are what led to his victory. So we would call those, the major divisions of the paper. More about that in a minute. Now, an evaluative paper then makes a claim of value, gives reasons to support it. So next week, we'll take a look at a sample essay about the motion picture Juno. And so if you're writing about a movie, one what makes question is what makes Juno a good movie, or what makes Juno a bad movie. And it may turn out to be that there are answers to both of those questions. And if you look at the thesis that accompanies that essay, although the situations Juno's characters find themselves in and their dialogue may be criticized as unrealistic, the film, written by Diablo Cody and directed by Jason Reitman, successfully portrays the emotions of a teen being shoved into maturity way too fast. So you'll actually see both components there. There are a couple of things the film at least does in a way that's characterized here as unrealistic, the characters and the dialogue. But the overall effect of the movie, according to the thesis, and what the paper will argue, is that it does an excellent job of portraying that emotional effect. If you're not familiar with Juno, it's a film about a teen girl who becomes pregnant and has to work through that situation. And so, like I said, we'll examine that entire piece a little more next week as we look at paragraph development and moving from one idea to another. Right now, we're just trying to frame the thesis, and so what you'll need to do to capture the thesis is two things: tension and division. Now, if I asked you for the common characteristics of these two statements, I've obviously highlighted in yellow the most common similarity between the two. They both begin with the word although. And although is a word that does a great job of adding tension to an idea. Now, I have a complete separate presentation that you can watch right after this one that talks about adding tension to your thesis. But I think what I'll just kind of introduce it here by working through this first thesis and point out what it is about that, what the tension is and what it does for the thesis. Now, as I said before, as far as Truman's victory, those predictions themselves, Dewey's passiveness, Truman's zeal, those are the three divisions. And when you read that paper, you'll see that I think the writer dedicates 2 paragraphs to each of these topics. The predictions, the polls, how poor a candidate or how poor a campaign Dewey ran, and what a really exciting campaign Truman ran. So those become the answer to the why, how question. But that first part of it, although Truman's defeat was heavily predicted, that's the tension. That's where the interest is. People read about and write about the 1948 presidential campaign because the result was a surprise. Nobody writes about the 1936 campaign because there was no surprise. People expected Roosevelt to win, and he won. You could make the same point about the 2016 election. It's interesting because Trump won despite being predictions that Hillary Clinton would win. And that's what's going on here. That's what the tension then is, what adds interest to the topic. Or it shows that there are really 2 attitudes in conflict or working or present at the same time, 2 maybe opposite views, and that's where interest lies as well. And that's what the Juno thesis does. Although the situations Juno's characters find themselves in and their dialogue are maybe criticized as unrealistic, well, that's true, but the film successfully portrays the emotions of a teen being shoved into maturity way too fast. Now, that doesn't mean we don't write about those first 2 things. In fact, the essay does. It discusses how the characters and the dialogue may be considered unrealistic. Like many people in movies, the characters are too cool, too clever. They say things that most of us, couldn't think or wouldn't think of to say at the moment. But in the end, the film is successful because it connects emotionally with the audience. So that's what we mean by tension and divisions. So next, I'll talk about how to add tension to a thesis. One of your assignments this week will be to create a preliminary thesis for your paper, something that you and I will work on the next couple of next 2 weeks or so that thesis really helps shape what you're trying to say and communicate it to the audience. So watch that one next.